November 1st, 1700. The inbred and sickly King of Spain, Carlos II, dies at the age of 38, with no heir to replace him, leaving the vast, rich Spanish Empire without ruler. The two great dynasties of Europe, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, raced for the throne, only for the crisis to spark into all-out war. Forgotten in history, the war would last around 13 years, with war waged on such a scale and devastation not seen since the 30 Years' War, on several fronts, on multiple continents. This is the War of the Spanish Succession. The year of 1708 ended with French military defeats, famine, and political crisis. The Battle of Oudenarde and the subsequent Battle of Wijnendale marked the end of the campaign in Flanders. The city of Lille, with a garrison of 16,000 men, led by the Duc de Boufflers, surrendered on the 10th of December that year. During the siege, he had held down the entire Allied army for the rest of the campaign and incurred over 16,000 Allied casualties for his 7,000. However, the fall of Lille meant the opening up of most other fortresses surrounding it. The French army of Flanders, commanded by the now 65-year-old Marshal Boufflers, was in tatters. The Archbishop of Cambrai, François Fenelon, wrote to King Louis XIV on the state of the army. He described it as undisciplined, without order, affection, or spirit, and that the whole of France would not see such things return until peace was achieved immediately. Intendant Bernier wrote that the magazines were completely empty, the soldiers were unpaid, and the few officers who did report for duty had nothing for subsistence. Supplies could not be delivered out of fear of hungry civilians attacking their supply trains. Dutch dragoons raided as far as the environs of Paris. Boufflers attempted to remedy the army's problems, but this monumental task proved too much for his age. He became hospitalized in Paris soon after. The condition of the Army of Flanders wasn't France's only problem. The winter of 1708 through 09 proved to be one of the most tragic in history. Contemporarily named the Great Winter, crops would not grow, and food became scarce for civilians and soldiers alike. With famine, low morale, and a battered army, Louis XIV reopened negotiations in The Hague that same winter. The Allies accepted the offer, thinking that the French army could no longer continue a long war. The Sun King did not oppose most of the terms, even willing to give up the Spanish campaign if need be, but one term bothered him most of all. To achieve peace now with the Allies would mean ousting his grandson Philip V off the Spanish throne with military force. The Sun King saw it as a complete humiliation and disgrace to be asked to fight his own grandson and give up the throne of Spain. Peace talks at The Hague quickly concluded and the war would continue, and so came the task of rebuilding the Army of Flanders into a well-equipped, trained, and led fighting force. This monumental task would fall under the Marshal Claude Hector de Villars, who immediately began inspecting all the encampments on the frontier. To his surprise, the men themselves were in surprisingly high spirits compared to what others had previously described. The NCOs and lower officers, stoic as those, quote, during the days of Marcus Aurelius. However, the rest of his inspection found the grain stores empty, nothing having been prepared or organized, very few men paid, and men with no uniforms or missing parts of them such as their boots. The Marshal first berated and focused on the Minister of War, the Marquis de Chamillard. Upon his first visit to him, Villars burst through the door and shouted, "You are the Secretary of War. Do you not realize you are exposing yourself to horrible reproaches if you do not supply me? How is it that we do not have boots and bread, and that our weapons are unserviceable?" Needless to say, he was shown the door, but he didn't quit and went after the military contractors, strong-arming them into giving up 2 weeks of grain to supply the army by the 31st of May. He wrote to the Sun King himself, and even gained his support, giving him more grain to the Army of Flanders to feed from. This small feat was enough to boost the morale of the common soldier. With time, slowly but surely, the Army of Flanders pulled itself back together. The men were well drilled, somewhat decently fed, and had their still high spirits kindled. The French cavalry were retrained to fight in the style of the Allied cavalry. Chamillart was replaced with Daniel Voisin, who promised to forward materials to the army, and that promise he didn't keep. Villars forced the other quartermasters to equip, feed, and pay their soldiers. All these actions earned Villars great respect from his men. The soldiers were more confident in their commander more than any other they had previously served under. Villars began looking for other officers to aid him on the new campaign. The Duc de Boufflers, now healed, offered his services once again, only on the condition that he served under Villars' command. The Marshal's old enemies at Versailles were shocked, but had to give in to have such an able commander back on the front. Boufflers' able defense of Lille was a widely praised one. His presence in the army significantly boosted morale. After months of hard work and rebuilding, Villars finally received news of the terms that the Allies proposed for peace. He lined up his battalions and gave them his word. "Soldiers, the only hope of an honorable peace relies on your bayonets. Although we are outnumbered 4 to 1, we will ask for no quarter and give none." To this he received cheers of "Long live the King" and "Long live the Marshal." The Allies, on the other hand, were still convinced that the French Army of Flanders could no longer fight. Whilst Villars rebuilt the army in Flanders, good news came from Spain after a significant battle fought on the 17th of May. Although the French army had been largely pulled from Spain to reinforce the frontier, the newly reformed Spanish army took its chance to prove that it could do more than stand its ground. The Marquis de Bois, leading an outnumbered army of 16,000 Spaniards, marched towards Portugal to counter a new Anglo-Portuguese army led by the Earl of Galway and the Count of Torre. Their army numbered around 25,000 men, crossing the river Caya to Badajoz. The Allies attempted to stretch out their forces to show their numerical superiority, but to their surprise, the Spanish right-wing cavalry charged with the Marquis himself. The sudden charge took the first line of infantry by surprise. Their fire upon the Spanish horsemen proved ineffective. De Bois' right-wing Spanish cavalry crashed into the Portuguese first line of cavalry. The Portuguese cavalry fled in less than a half hour, leaving the artillery batteries behind them completely unprotected. 3 English infantry regiments nearby engaged and attempted to retake the battery. This prompted the Spanish dragoons to dismount and engage the English regiments. After some contact, the English withdrew to a building nearby. Galway abandoned his men to their fate and ran off. The English soldiers in the building were almost all killed or captured. The rest of the Allied center sounded the retreat before the Spanish infantry engaged them. Once again, Spanish cavalry had dominated the field and sent an enemy with their backs to the river fleeing. Around 4,000 Anglo-Portuguese troops were killed or captured for just 400 Spaniards. Many standards and cannon were left behind. Brigadier Henry Crofton in the first line of the right-wing Spanish cavalry reported, "All the cavalry of the 2 lines of the enemies left was, in less than half an hour, broken, overthrown, and put to flight." Galway never saw a major command again. Neither could the Allies launch an invasion from Portugal. The victory, often ignored in the history of the war, was a stunning success. In Flanders, the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugen enveloped the city of Tournai. At first, this news almost came about as good to Villars. He hoped to prolong the siege to prevent a general action between his forces and those of the Grand Alliance. Although his army's condition was improving, there were still days without pay, days without food for hard labor. Trusting the city to put up a spirited defense like that of Lille's, he moved his defensive line between Douai and Denain. The city held on just long enough and flew the white flag on the 3rd of September. Villars believed their next move would be directed at Mons to lay siege to it. Mons was defended by only a few battalions and squadrons of Spanish and Bavarian troops. Villars knew that the fall of Mons, combined with the fall of Tournai, would open up Douai and Denain to attack. It was of utmost importance to either relieve the garrison or delay the Allied army in a general engagement. By the 8th of September, Eugen and Marlborough's armies encamped around Mons' walls. Villars almost had an opportunity to attack while the Allies were strung out on the march, but a lagging behind supply convoy prevented such an endeavor. The next day, his advance guard reached the woods near the small hamlet of Malplaquet. The Allies at first had no idea of Villars' quick march to the area. For once, the Duke of Marlborough, renowned for his speed and agility, was taken by complete surprise. Marlborough immediately called for Eugen to join him, and he repositioned his army to face the French end at Malplaquet. For the next day, the men on both sides prepared themselves for the battle that would decide the fate of France. Curiously, during the night before, men from both sides would leave their entrenchments to mingle and fraternize with each other. Even senior officers were reported to have done so. Even before such a bloody battle as Malplaquet, humanity between the men remained. It is the morning of September 11th, 1709. Around 160,000 men awake for battle. For nearly tens of thousands, it would be their last morning alive. The previous day, the French army dug in front of Malplaquet, a hamlet located before the thick woods of the Bois de Sars and the Bois de Lagnier. Attacking these heavily wooded areas would be difficult, and forced the Allies into attacking in two directions. In the center were the smaller Bois de Thierry and the Blairon farm. This would provide an obstacle between the Dutch troops under Tilly and Willem Frieso of Orange on the Allied left, and those under Laudon and Marlborough in the center. Prince Eugen and General Johann Matthias von der Schulenburg would be tasked with attacking the Bois de Sars. Most of the Allied cavalry concentrated itself in the center behind the infantry to oppose that of the French, which were similarly positioned. Mufflet commanded the French right wing, in front of the Bois de Lagnier, to the Blairon farm. Villars commanded the left flank in the Bois de Sars and the leftward redans. The French deployed their men to defensive positions. The men in the Bois de Sars utilized down trees which are turned into abattis. The troops in the center were entrenched in redans specifically built to allow cavalry to pass through if needed. Among the troops in the center were the Maison du Roi cavalry and the French and Swiss Guard regiments, which held their own brigade. At 7:30 a.m. in the morning, the Allied guns finally opened up with a salvo, signaling the attack to commence. The first to attack on the Bois de Sars fell under Schulenburg. Prince Eugen and Schulenburg's Imperials formed up and began their advance. Unfortunately, the ground proved very wet and marshy. Of 12 guns, only 7 could be carried through due to the rest sinking in the mud. As the Imperials approached the first line of defense, 4 battalions of the Regiment du Roi of Gosbriand's brigade were met first. Their opening fire, according to Schulenburg, caused immense disorder in the first line of the brigades attacking the woods. Many men fell dead or dying in the first volley alone. The French fire stopped the Imperials in their tracks, and for a short while caused them to hesitate and fall back a few paces in disorder. After this critical volley, 2 major generals and most of the officers of each battalion were killed. The terrain was so difficult that Schulenburg could not commit any significant flanking maneuver. He remarked, "It took 2 or 3 men to help 1 man pass through the entanglements." The second and third line were forced to come up to support the attack, tightly packing the Allied troops together. Eventually, the Danish brigade became the first to finally breach the French main defenses. In the end, however, they made themselves master of it, as well as 6 pieces of cannon that were there, Schulenburg would retell in his memoirs. The French brigades began withdrawing behind their second line of defenses, and continued firing upon the Imperialists, this line being even more formidable than the last. General Schulenburg was forced to deploy skirmishers, taken from platoons of the line infantry. The Imperials found that they could just not reach their Frenchmen in time to engage them effectively. The French fired a volley and then retired about 80 paces with good precision to repeat the process. General Walker-Barth wrote in his memoirs that the fire was so effective that one would expect it from, to quote, the greatest infantry in the world. By now, almost all of the officers in the leading Imperial battalions were reported to be killed or wounded. It took at least another quarter of an hour to pass through the second line of abattis. The soldiers being forced to jump over branches and trees, the Bois de Sars only continued to worsen conditions for the attackers. Luckily for them, Galvain's 1900 Hanoverians arrived to reinforce the right flank. They fell onto the southeastern edge of the Bois de Sars, marching relatively unopposed. As Schulenburg attacked the Bois de Sars, Allied guns were heavily bombarding the corner of the woods near them. The fire was devastating against the abattis and caused immense French casualties. However, the Frenchmen were still determined to repel the assault and turned toward their muskets. General Laudon brought forward his Prussian brigades and Argyll's British brigade to attack. Their objective to dislodge the Irish and Champagne brigades opposing them and join Schulenburg. Cannon from the French lines near the woods opened fire on the advancing columns. According to Colonel Jean-Martin de la Colonie, almost no shot missed its mark. Cannon fire shot entire ranks to pieces, but these ranks were replaced no later than they were destroyed. Colonie took note of an elderly senior officer who, despite his age and the amount of death around him, led with such energy and vigor that no sign of a routing enemy was seen anywhere. The men kept marching on with great discipline. Laudon's infantry were far more successful and pushed past the abattis and into the Bois de Sars. Schulenburg's deadly attack was blamed on his misunderstanding of orders, that he had attacked far sooner than planned. The French artillery general, Saint-Hilaire, noted that, to quote, their maneuver was excellent. These people know war well. Marlborough even rode over and personally congratulated General Laudon. By 11 a.m., the French troops were largely driven from the northern edges of the Bois de Sars, however, at a far larger cost to the Allies. For 4 hours, smaller French forces held off an immense assault for as long as they could. 30 minutes after the first attack on the Bois de Sars, the Dutch infantry, under the command of Willem Frieser, the Prince of Orange, led his men to the French defenses between the Bois de Lagny and the Blair Enfant. The first attack was to be conducted on the edge of the Bois de Lagny. What the Dutch did not know would prove fatal. The redans there had been built in a way to recreate a re-entrant. Its purpose was to draw the Dutch in, only to be met with a well-hidden 20-gun battery. On the right, Pallant's brigade entered and quickly cleared the Blairon farm of skirmishers. Pallant then drove off some French defenders from the entrenchments nearby. Returning enfilade fire from the French batteries halted them in their tracks and caused Pallant's attack to quickly falter. The Dutch attack had kicked into full gear along the French right wing. Devastating French musket fire and artillery enfilade began to inflict horrendous casualties. The Dutch Blue Guards' 2nd Battalion itself lost around 60% of its ranks. The French counterattacked and retook some of the defenses. The leading Navarre Brigade drove back the Scots in the north and recaptured some regimental standards. The Allied cavalry behind them covered the retreat of the Dutch infantry and prevented a French pursuit. The Prince of Orange rode over to the Hanoverian troops nearby and requested for their support in a renewed attack. One of his generals, Goslinga, shouted to the retreating Dutchmen, "The battle is won, brave men," as he galloped on horse to the front. Orange's horse was shot from underneath him, but he continued on foot. Despite the immense bravery displayed by all the Dutch soldiers and their generals, the second attack failed, resulting in the Dutch withdrawal unharassed to their original positions around 10 a.m. In just 30 minutes, over 5,000 Allied soldiers lay dead or wounded. The French had held. With strict orders from Villars to not leave the entrenchments on the French right wing, Boufflers held and reorganized his position. General Goslinga begged Marlborough and Eugen for reinforcements on another attack on the French right. After seeing the horrific cost of such a maneuver, they declined. There was no point in creating more casualties against a position they could not hope to take. However, because of the ferocity of the Dutch attack, Boufflers' infantry, all of them, and his reserves, were pinned down on the French right. He could not answer any request for more troops from Villars to reinforce him. Meanwhile, in the Bois du Sars, Schulenburg remarked. The battalions moved pell-mell. There were no generals in the center who were able to remedy this. Everything was in great confusion, and our men suffered many casualties. Finally, we arrived at the edge of the wood overlooking the plain. There we saw the French cavalry in order of battle, and their infantry behind another entrenchment supported by cavalry. All that was humanly possible was done to collect the battalions and form a line. Marlborough and Eugen immediately then moved to the Bois du Sars to aid Schulenburg. So close they were to the heavy fighting that Eugen was wounded when a bullet grazed his ear. Even legendary commanders like he were not ignored by the immense fire. Villars observed the combat in the Sars from the edge of the woods. He took the liberty to describe it as a sort of jaws of fire, sulfur of hell, a pit of fire, sulfur and saltpeter, which seemed impossible to approach and live. Now he knew it was the critical moment for a counterattack. Villars reformed his brigades for one last attack. The French troops in the Bois du Sars launched their assault. It was fierce and seemed unstoppable, but the Allied defenders managed to hold their ground, though they were pinned down and couldn't offer support in the center. Villars rallied the support of the survivors from earlier, but just before he could commence the attack, Villars was wounded in the knee, along with Albergati and other key officers that were supposed to lead it. In Villars' memoirs, he remarked, "One shot and my horse fell. I jumped up and a second broke my knee, but I had it bandaged on the spot and myself placed in a chair to continue giving orders. But the pain caused a fainting fit, which lasted long enough for me to be carried off without regaining consciousness. That is all I know about the end of the battle." The French left's command fell down to the command of individual brigade and battalion officers. The planned attack ground to a complete halt. Boufflers promptly became commander of the whole army, but he still remained on the French right wing. He saw the Dutch had reformed what seemed like another attack, and did not commit more forces to the left. Unbeknownst to him, Marlborough gave strict orders to the Prince of Orange not to conduct another assault. Once Marlborough found the French redans abandoned, he ordered the cavalry from the center forward. The redans must be seized. The Swiss and French guard stood in the way, extending their line. However, they were tired, for unknown reasons, after not being shot at even once. The forward Allied battalions then occupied the redans by 1 p.m. It is important to note for the following engagement that the Allied cavalry had suffered no casualties, whilst the French cavalry had taken many from the Allied artillery bombardment. Marlborough ordered his cavalry to pass through the redans and attack the French. Boufflers, seeing the Allied advance, mounted his own horse and joined the ranks of the Maison du Roi. As the Allied cavalry advanced, the French immediately charged into their ranks. Over 60,000 men, split up nearly evenly on both sides, engaged in the largest cavalry battle of the age. The French cavalry successfully beat back the first Allied squadrons and then the second line. The Allied cavalry was only saved by infantry fire from the redans. On this day, the Allied cavalry would charge 6 times against the French, and were driven back almost every time. The French cavalry of Malplaquet were not those of Blenheim, Ramillies, or Oudenarde. They had learned from the previous battles and drove the sword home. While the cavalry battle in the center raged on, The French left had been turned by the arrival of cavalry from General MacDowall. The Allied infantry were too exhausted to pursue, however, and the rest of the infantry slipped away. MacDowall was in trouble when he met the reserves on the French left. The famous French Carabineers countercharged the Imperial cavalrymen. Irishman Peter Drake, serving in the French gendarmes, was cut off from his squadron with a few others. He found himself surrounded by several Imperial cavalrymen. With most cavalry preferring to use firearms instead of swords in melee, Drake fired his carbine into a Hanoverian dragoon officer opposing him. The Hanoverian missed his shot, while Drake's met its mark. Drake escaped with 2 bullets grazing his coat and 1 lodged in his cuirass. General MacDowall's flanking force had been successfully driven off. However, with the Bois de Sars nearly lost, French generals were convinced that it would be wise to retreat, now, as the cavalry battle in the center stalemated. Boufflers saw he had missed an opportunity to turn his right flank onto the enemy, and went with the order to retreat. By the standards of the day, the French gave up the field to the Grand Alliance, thus technically making them the losers of the battle tactically. However, to simplify this battle down to such a level would be inappropriate. Although the French army quit the field, they would only suffer around 11,000 casualties for the Allies' 22,000 to 26,000 and left in good order, keeping the army intact to fight another day. The Allies had been battered and halted in their advance towards Paris. Sergeant John Miller of the British Army remarked, "Although the enemy lost the field, they recovered a part of their former reputation by standing the attack so boldly as they did." The Battle of Malplaquet would be known as the bloodiest battle ever seen in Europe to this point, and will remain that for the next century. When news of the death toll came out, all of Europe was horrified at the carnage. Never before had such a battle been fought. The field was so filled with death that Marlborough asked the French for a 3-day truce to bury the dead and round up the wounded. Allied confidence in continuing the war also came into questioning. The Dutch were especially horrified at their 9,000 casualties compared to other Allied armies. The commanders of the Grand Alliance then quickly fell into blaming each other for the defeat, for failing to support one another. Overall, the battle can be reasonably called a strategic French victory, but not a tactical one. They had slowed down the Allied advance greatly, to the point where there were no major battles for the next 2 years, but only sieges and small isolated skirmishes, while Villars' wounds healed. At home in Britain, Marlborough began to lose popularity among the government as anti-war sentiments grew. The horrendous casualties suffered at Lille, Tournai, and Malplaquet, combined with defeats in Spain, would slowly pressure Britain out of the war by 1711. The war from now on would shift in favor of the Bourbons.